I'm Alistair Campbell, and you're listening to the Ireland Podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Ireland Podcast. This is Fender Jackson. The time is 1:16 p.m. on Wednesday, the 1st of July, 2026. I am in my home in Galway, talking with this person. Who are you and what do you do?
Hello, I'm Katy Hayward. I'm Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University, Belfast.
Thank you for joining me, Katy. We already spent one entire episode talking about Brexit before 2016 and how it came into play and up to 2017. So I'd like to take it from there, looking at the different solutions that were made available, put on offer, and if we could start around 2017, that'd be fantastic.
Very good. So 2017 is a good place to start because it was really when the negotiations commenced properly, of course. And then at the end of 2017, we had a mapping exercise conducted between UK and EU officials on where EU membership made a difference in North-South cooperation. And at the end of 2017, the UK and the EU issued something called a joint report. And they said, this is the progress made and these are things that we agree upon. And part of the reason why they did that was because it was quite clear that there were some areas in which they really didn't agree. And one of those was the Irish border, what to do about it. So in 2017, they said in the joint report, there are three possible scenarios. One is the UK has a free trade agreement that fixes the Irish border as it says it wants to do, just a straight up agreement, and the Irish border being a problem. Or else there will be special arrangements for Northern Ireland, which the EU is generally saying would need to be in place. Or the third option was basically the UK aligns with the single market and customs union. So those were the three things in which the sort of three possible scenarios. And one also other important thing to note then was that the UK said that there should be no physical checks or controls at the Irish border. It made that commitment. And that was something that would be returned to in the coming year in 2018 as they got into the nitty-gritty of the negotiations and drafting the protocol. Say, well, if you're making that commitment to no physical checks and controls at the Irish border, then what possible scenario would enable that to happen?
I'm having a wry smile because I've been reading on the comments of social media posts I've been putting out there. The Irish border. Surely you mean the British border. So you're talking about the border between UK and European Union here, aren't you? Which is
yes,
the land border on the island of Ireland.
Yes. Yes. So it's between Ireland and Northern Ireland. It's, as some people say, it's the border that the British put across the island of Ireland, etc. But yes, it's the Irish land border, which was, of course, becoming an external border between the UK and the EU post-Brexit.
Yeah, so unless we refer to it as unless we're talking about anything else, we'll be mostly talking about that border. Yeah, so we might call it British border.
We talk about the Irish Sea border, but we will make sure to make that clear.
So the Prime Minister at the time was Theresa May, and what was the first package that was come up with?
So she came up with the first version of the withdrawal agreement that was put to Parliament. So this was in November 2018, and the first version of the protocol proper. And this ended up being called the Backstop. So the version of the protocol was basically saying essentially that Northern Ireland would be aligning with EU rules, so there would be avoiding a hard Irish border. But the UK also made a commitment as a whole, and it was saying if there are rules that the Northern Ireland has to align with to avoid the border actually having an effect as a customs border, a single market border, then the UK as a whole would align with those. So the protocol was understood as a backstop because it was essentially saying, in the as the UK hoped, it would be an unlikely scenario of checks and controls being required, the UK as a whole would align. And the way to understand this is essentially that Theresa May was prioritising the union of the UK over the nature of Brexit. So even though in principle they recognised that there needed to be alignment of the same rules, so the same rules need to be followed on both sides of the border to mean that you don't need those checks and controls. Then the UK as a whole was committing to align to whichever of those would be the ones that would be requiring checks and controls. Now, this became obviously, and unsurprisingly, extremely controversial. And there were 3 votes, if I recall correctly, in the Parliament about this backstop. The rest of the withdrawal agreement, people were pretty happy with, I think, but it was about this commitment that the UK was making in the withdrawal agreement, to be like the backstop for Northern Ireland, and each of those votes failed. So Theresa May failed to get it across the line, and despite the DUP having said that they would support Theresa May in its confidence and supply agreement with the government, it actually voted against this deal. So then we're back to the start point. And it's strange to recall it, but this was very last minute. So the votes were happening in 2019, and the clock was ticking because the UK was due to leave the EU on the 29th of March 2019.
So that was going to happen any which way. They would have been booted out
if they hadn't got an extension. So there was this sense of time pressure that was really being used, and the sense was, if the UK doesn't get this through, then they'll be leaving without a deal. And then we had all those people who were saying, well, sure, bring it on, the sense of, well, it's fine to have a no deal. It's the UK civil servants were being tasked with preparing for a no deal Brexit. So they're actively trying to avoid catastrophe if the UK had left the EU without a deal. But as it was, those votes failed. But the UK government had negotiated an emergency sort of extension of the deadline by the time of 29th of March rolled around.
I'm remembering Jim Allister from the hardline TUV, Traditional Unionist Voice Party, referring to the backstop as it would make the UK a vassal state.
Yes.
So was that the main argument, that UK couldn't make its own laws, that they had to fall in line with EU?
Well, no. So this was a lot of the debate that was going on, and it was essentially down to the fact of how much you have to align with rules to avoid the checks and controls. And the UK government, I think, was pretty much of the view that it wouldn't need to align with a whole swathe of EU rules, that it would almost be on a one-by-one basis. Now, in retrospect, that's extremely optimistic thinking. However, the principle of having to align with any EU rules post-Brexit was one that was anathema to many hardline Brexiteers, including Jim Allister, which is then particularly difficult for those in Northern Ireland, given that's what Northern Ireland ended up doing with the second version of the withdrawal agreement.
And I'm confused as to why DUP were playing ball with the Conservative Party up until the vote, and then voting against the Conservative Party. What was that about?
Well, if I'm honest with you, I don't think they were necessarily playing ball all the time anyway. I mean, they got a lot more publicity and there was a lot more interest in their position as a result of that confidence and supply agreement. But all of that time, they were really a bit of a thorn in the side of Theresa May, I think, because they were very much of the view that there should be a hard Brexit and wanting to push back against the EU. I mean, infamously, I remember Arlene Foster as a DUP leader at the time, saying, there wasn't, she didn't really know what the issue was because, there's never been a hard border on the island of Ireland, she said. So even she was repeating the mantra of that had been the point that had been made by Theresa May as the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland beforehand. So just this sense of it's not really a problem, downplaying the complexity of the issue. I think yes, they did become problematic for Theresa May, and when it mattered, they didn't come through for her in terms of those votes. What's interesting too is what was happening in terms of Labour. So even though she managed to get most of the Conservative Party voting in support of the withdrawal agreement, because it was voted on 3 times, that particular version, they had like certain things to sort of try and reassure them. But it was Labour, of course, who was voting against each time too, and then some, so essentially bulk of Labour Party voting against because they didn't want to be voting for withdrawal at all. So there's an interesting period of time then where trying to, sort of the protocol as it was then was probably the best possibility for the union, if you like, for the UK union to sort of minimise the disruption of Brexit and that Brexit would cause to the island of Ireland and to the UK union as a whole. But it was one that was most unlikely for Labour to vote for, simply because it just didn't want to be seen to be voting for Brexit.
Right. I'm wondering what internal politics was being played with within the Conservative Party at the time.
Yes, there's a great book by Russell and James on it's called Parliamentary Brexit and Parliament. I can't remember the exact title, but it's basically they followed the development of all these debates in detail in Parliament and showed just quite how devastating it was really for the Conservative Party in particular. And so they go into all the they have lots of interviews with people who are involved, and you just see the disintegration of trust within the party itself. Because of course you have the pressure on Theresa May from the very start, questioning whether she really, as a Remain supporter, whether she could really be trusted over Brexit. So even though, as we mentioned in the last podcast, that she took that hard line on the Lancaster House speech, in actual fact, they were always querying whether she would really bring Brexit for the UK. And so when you had this version of the withdrawal agreement that appeared to be making some sneaky commitment to remaining close to the EU, then that really revealed a lot of tensions and distrust within the Conservative Party itself.
And you're referring to that Brexit means Brexit comment that she made, which resulted in them leaving the customs union and the European market. What it confused me was and you mentioned Daniel Hannan, he was shocked at that. So if we just lump Daniel Hannan in with the pro-Brexiters, what was their vision of what Brexit was?
But their vision of Brexit became more hardline as the negotiations went on. And I think that's partly because in that sort of phony war period before they started proper, that was a chance for people to say, well, what does this mean? And then for people to really think, well, the EU is all of these things, cohesion policy, CAP, fisheries, Horizon research funding, Erasmus, structural funds, common, customs union and single market. So all of these things, people began to think, well, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? And then actually the pro-Brexit campaign kind of was able to say, well, if it's worth leaving at all, we're going to leave in a strong way. We're going to make it sort of worth our while so that we can get those trade agreements with other countries, most particularly the US was where they wanted the trade deal. And so that we can set our own laws, etc. So they kind of became more hardline as it became more coherent, if you like. So by the time Theresa May was bringing back what was, of course, a compromise, it's a negotiation, people say, well, what does this actually mean for our right to set our own rules? And when they realised, well, there would be, of course, some potential means by which that could be curtailed, then they were saying, no, we're not going to accept that.
So after the third vote with Theresa May, what happened?
So Theresa May ended up leaving. She found it impossible to keep the party together and to go back to negotiate with the EU again, now over time, of course, and having clearly not been able to bring the Parliament with her. So she was soon, she resigned as leader of the Conservative Party, and Boris Johnson was her successor. Obviously, Boris Johnson had led one of the Leave campaigns, and there'd been a lot of speculation. I mean, he was obviously causing difficulties for her, even when he was in her government. And so he came in, having said that he had been extremely opposed to the backstop, so-called, and having said that he would never accept any treatment of Northern Ireland that would be different to the rest of the UK, also promising a hard Brexit. So he came into the negotiations. Now, I remember this period very well in 2019, because this was when we really had the quest for alternative arrangements. So many of those who are pro-Brexit and others were saying what the EU is proposing here in terms of alignment of rules is just them chancing their arm. In actual fact, you can have technological solutions to this problem, or alternative arrangements to what's being proposed here. So there was some MPs were involved, some private, some think tanks involved in coming up with these alternative arrangements. Prosperity UK was leading on this. And at the same time, the British government itself also wanted to look into alternative arrangements. So how can you manage the various challenges around the Irish border without aligning with EU rules? And I was appointed as a technical expert on the British government's group to advise that group on what such alternative arrangements might be.
Carry on.
Well, so at the same time, in 2019, fortuitously, I had the honour of being awarded an Eisenhower Fellowship to go to the US. And I was able to go to the US and look at the way in which they used technology to manage their borders with Canada and Mexico, because people kept saying the US does it better than anywhere else. You know, they use technology, they have facial recognition and APNR and it also, ground radar sensors, etc., etc. And they can use technology in a way that we should learn from to try and keep the Irish border invisible, but have it as a hard external border. So I went to the US and I discovered that, yes, technology can help, certainly, but the challenge of managing a border, well, it depends on the nature of the border that you're trying to manage. What is it that you're trying to control the movement of? And for example, if you have a border for the movement of live animals or for meat products or fruit and veg or whatever, at some point you're going to need to inspect those goods. So you can't use technology for a lorry coming through and assess that lorry coming through to see there's a sheep on there that is diseased, or there's there's a tomato in there that's got a disease or whatever it might be, that you actually have to physically unload those products and inspect them. So taking all that learning back to the group, I wrote a paper on basically what is border management, what are we trying to do? And the nub of it was basically you need to be able to know what is crossing the border, know that it meets the criteria for crossing, and if it doesn't, be able to stop that movement. So I wrote this paper, and I think it's safe to say that genuinely it had zero impact on the outcome.
Who was the audience for that paper?
Yes, the panel, the audience was just the other experts in the group, which was a fascinating group. Unsurprisingly, I was the only sociologist there, but it was mainly, they had obviously lawyers, but it was mainly like business, security was represented, agriculture, food and drink, some of the most problematic areas for managing the Irish border.
All within all
But
business. Sorry, all representatives from the north
sorry.
of Ireland.
No, no, there were only a small minority of us were from the north, yeah, or from the island.
And the rest were from England?
The rest were from mainly from Britain, yeah, but there were some from elsewhere in Europe as well. I mean, they genuinely wanted experts. Now, that was a technical expert panel. They also had groups where they were looking at customs, particularly, and agriculture, particularly. So they were looking at different aspects that they knew were critical. And it's quite interesting because, and I won't reminisce too much about it, but for me, it sort of showed defining the problem was key. And so often we didn't get to that thing, well, what is the problem that we're trying to solve here? It quickly went into, well, not wanting the solution that was proposed. This was a lot of the thinking. Well, we don't want to do that here at the Irish border for that reason, or whether it's follow EU rules or whether it's put up checks and controls and border posts, and then trying to find alternatives to that without really thinking, well, what is it that we need to be able to do at this border? I say it had zero impact because at the same time, of course, Boris Johnson and David Frost, as lead negotiator, were negotiating with the EU, and they were coming up with potential solutions as well. And before we had finalised any report from this expert panel or from the group, it was announced that they had come up with an agreement, with a second version of the withdrawal agreement.
Looking from the outside, Boris Johnson struck me as an individual who either didn't get Northern Ireland or didn't care to get Northern Ireland. How fair is that assessment? I would say, the Northern Ireland situation, particularly with Brexit.
So an ongoing concern on the island of Ireland, particularly in the north of Ireland, is the lack of, it's how peripheral Northern Ireland is, or the island is, to Westminster in particular. And we mentioned before, I think, about the asymmetry of the Union, and the relationships between these islands. So then you add into this an extra dimension when it comes to Boris Johnson and others like him, and that we really saw exposed in Brexit, and that is the fact that they are making all important decisions with several things going on in their minds. They are calculating what might happen, how Northern Ireland features in this. And before he became Prime Minister, Northern Ireland was very helpful to him because he was able to use that Northern Ireland situation to be able to say, this is outrageous that Northern Ireland be treated differently from the rest of the UK, and Theresa May can't be trusted as Prime Minister. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially the thing. So he was able to use Northern Ireland to bolster his own credentials within the hardliners and to be able to bring, destabilise her position even further. However, when he comes into power, then he's faced with the question of, well, either you treat Northern Ireland differently or you do prioritise the Union, but you can't have your hard Brexit. And he prioritised Brexit. He's also thinking, of course, calculating dynamics within his own party and his own political career. And Northern Ireland, it's not going to win him votes. It could potentially lose him votes, though, given, obviously, Conservatives don't, they don't really tend to get seats from Northern Ireland. So that's his calculation. So I wouldn't talk about him necessarily as an individual, although we can a little bit later on if you wish. But I think he's representative of a fundamental repeated, this isn't anything new by any means, feature in British politicians' relationship with Northern Ireland.
I did some number crunching since we last talked about the asymmetry, and I was looking to see what's the percentage split. I have it here, actually.
Great.
Okay, so this is shocking to me. You mentioned the asymmetry. England, actually, I'll work backwards. Northern Ireland has got 18 seats. Wales has got 32. Scotland has 57. And England has 543. Percentage split. This is today now. This is not Brexit time. And which Brexit time? So anyway, today, Northern Ireland, 2.8% of Westminster. Wales, 4.9%. Scotland, 8.8%. And England, 83.5%. Yeah, I think you have a point with the asymmetry.
Yes, so that probably reflects more or less the population size. But when it comes to decision making for the whole of the UK state, then yes, it is a problem given the basis of decision making, obviously by majority vote, etc.
And then to flip that, Northern Ireland's MPs have a say on English politics, but English politicians don't have a say in Northern Ireland devolved parliament.
Yes, the so-called West Lothian question, and this is something that has been adjusted in recent years, and then it's still being fiddled with. It'd be interesting to see if Andy Burnham will do anything on this point as well. So they had made it possible for English MPs to be able to just vote for rules in England, but most people aren't aware of that. So people still have that sense of it being unfair that the other parts of the UK can vote on laws that only apply in England. So they have made adjustments, but it is still evolving. Hasn't settled once and for all.
A question is still niggling in my head here, and I'm pulling you back to Theresa May, I'm afraid. I'm wondering, the spectre of Boris Johnson is still there in my mind's eye. Was he stirring the apple cart for the vote? Was he power hungry for the premiership?
I watched the BBC programme Brexit Civil War recently, and there was an interview with his sister who was saying, do you remember when he wrote he was deliberating whether to go in favour of leave or remain, and she was saying, he was really thinking about what would make him most likely to be able to end up as Prime Minister. So, so I think that was, and others would say the same, that was sort of the calculation in his mind, always what was best for Boris Johnson.
Fascinating. So a lot of people put their party first or their country first or God first. Others don't.
Yeah.
Okay, so where are we and where do you want to take it from?
So where are we? So we've got up to 19th of October 2019 now, with the announcement of the new withdrawal agreement. Now, this is if we had a backstop with Theresa May, we've got a front stop with Boris Johnson. So by which I mean that the Northern Ireland would automatically be following EU rules. So not just if and when it arises, it seems that it's necessary, just right off the bat, a portion of the EU legislation, particularly that relating to product and food standards, would be being followed by Northern Ireland. And this is how we have a situation in which we end up with the Irish Sea border, so-called. So that's for two reasons. One is that goods coming from outside of the EU, including from Britain, have to go through certain checks and controls to enter Northern Ireland, which is de facto now part of the EU's customs union and single market for goods. And also anything made in Northern Ireland or grown or bred in Northern Ireland has to meet EU standards so that it can freely cross the Irish border with no problem. So I can talk in a lot of detail about the protocol. I'm trying to assess how much you want to know about it. But that's essentially the deal. So Boris Johnson said...
the protocol, this is a solution that was brainstormed between Boris Johnson and European Union.
Yes.
And this is the main one after the backstop.
Yes, so the backstop. So basically, they always knew they had to have a withdrawal agreement, and then they negotiate that withdrawal agreement, and then they'd be able to negotiate what comes next, which ended up being the trade and cooperation agreement. So the withdrawal agreement, the UK was desperate to get that over and done with, because that's the divorce. So, and as part of that hefty withdrawal agreement, you have a few protocols in there, one of which is the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, dealing specifically with this case. And the objectives of that are to maintain the conditions for North-South cooperation, to avoid a hard border, and to protect the 1998 agreement in all its dimensions. So that's the objectives of this protocol. And as it happens, probably unsurprisingly, obviously it was the most difficult part of the negotiations, most complex, most sensitive to be concluded. And it also ended up being the most difficult and complex and sensitive part to be implemented as well, I think it's fair to say. Mm-hmm. Part of that is because it was Boris Johnson denied what it was that he had agreed.
Sorry, you say I was such a straight face, and it's. Didn't he say something as well about breaking the law in a specific and limited way? Was it him or was it somebody else?
So you're fast forwarding us now to 2020. So it wasn't him; it was Brandon Lewis, who was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland at the time. Yes. So essentially, Boris Johnson announced the withdrawal agreement and the protocol, and he said that basically it upholds the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and it will be basically enabling the UK to have a Brexit with a few minimal bureaucratic consequences at a few points in Northern Ireland. I mean, he was seriously downplaying what it was that the protocol would require. Also, importantly, and another addition that he negotiated to the protocol was the democratic consent vote. So this is the Article 18. It's the last article in the withdrawal agreement, in the protocol, sorry. And this is saying that the Northern Ireland Assembly will get a vote every 4 years, possibly every 8 if there's consensus, but anyway, let's say every 4 years on a portion of the protocol, particularly that portion which sees Northern Ireland follow EU rules and sees checks and controls coming into Northern Ireland, on goods coming into Northern Ireland. So he was then able to say Northern Ireland gets to say over this protocol. You know, if they don't like it, they can get rid of it. I mean, there's all this sort of exaggeration about what he'd managed to negotiate. And the reason why this is so important, I mean, on the one hand, you've got the problem of Prime Minister lying about what he'd negotiated and agreed. And we gather from DUP MPs at the time that he had told them privately, don't worry, it doesn't entail this, that, or other, whatever experts might be saying. He privately reassured them. That's a problem. Another problem is people don't know what the heck it is they're meant to be implementing. You know, what it is they need to do to be able to comply with these rules. So this is another thing that, you know, I'm sort of trying to convey in relation to border management. It's most effectively managed if people know what they're meant to do to cross it. So if they don't, or if they've been given conflicting information or, you know, or misinformation indeed, Then, of course, there's going to be problems when people reach that border and discover they're not actually able to cross it with their goods because they haven't done the necessary paperwork. So it's like a perfect storm when you add in all the political sensitivities for a problem when it comes to implementing the protocol. If you want me to talk about Brandon Lewis breaking international law, so basically in 2020, early on in 2020, now bear in mind, this is when the UK now is negotiating for that second agreement, that second deal. They're beginning to realise the protocol actually has major consequences for Northern Ireland, its relationship with the rest of the UK. And they wanted to sort of roll back on that. They had to bring legislation into the UK to implement the protocol and the withdrawal agreement. And they had in the agreement they had, they were basically saying that, in the legislation they had drafted, they were basically to allow for that protocol to be broken. So hence Brandon Lewis saying, yes, this will break international law in a limited and specific way.
It's not good PR.
Not very wise to do when the EU, when you're basically saying we want this new deal with you, but the one you've just negotiated with us, we're about to break. I hope you don't mind.
It's painful to hear that, even coming from you. What type of damage did that do for the PR of the UK?
It did a lot of damage. I think obviously for the EU, they were thinking what extremely cautious. So they were cautious beforehand in the withdrawal negotiations. They were even more so in the negotiations of the TCA. So that trade and cooperation agreement is not a great deal for the UK. Now, partly it's because they weren't very ambitious in what they wanted. They wanted an agreement as quickly as possible. But also the EU wasn't prepared to concede very much. So that's damaging. On the international stage, again, the UK is wanting to do trade deals with various places, including the US. And of course, then they're there saying, we're just going to break this deal we've just done. So again, that's not great. But I think more fundamentally, it was extremely damaging within Northern Ireland, within these islands, because the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, of all people, saying the UK government is going to break international law. And bear in mind, the international agreement they were planning to break was an international agreement that was set up to protect the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, another international agreement. So it means we're in a whole new realm, with the British government saying quite explicitly, we're going to break this. And I would see as not too, it's probably quite predictable then that within a year, we had loyalist paramilitary groups saying we no longer recognise the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. Because this sense of, you're prepared to break an international agreement, that's kind of been almost legitimised, or at least it's something that people talk about openly in a post-Brexit context. I think that was just a terrible precedent to set. Even if he might say it was just sort of, maybe they were trying to, in their minds, they were trying to get the EU to move, to concede.
Yeah. This is a huge can of worms we're in now at the moment.
It is rather, yeah.
So at what point does Brexit happen? And then I'm wondering, how did that situation that we've just been talking about, how did that get resolved? So it's up to you which one you want to handle first.
So Brexit officially happened on the 31st of January 2020. The UK left the EU, but then it's in a transition period. So the transition period is so it's out of the EU, but the withdrawal agreement and the new in full and the new TCA is still being negotiated. So that won't come into effect until the 1st of January 2021. So Brexit proper such as it was expected to be, was really 1st of January 2021. So that's when you had the new rules applying on goods entering Northern Ireland, the protocol coming into effect 1st of January 2021. One thing we mustn't lose sight of is the fact that it was, this has been negotiated in 2020, coming into effect in 2021. Yesterday, as it happened, I did a big office clear up and trying to sort all my Brexit stuff into files. And it's quite interesting just to sort of see it physically there, because I've got so much stuff, as you might imagine, like conference programs and things that were published by people on Brexit and this, that, and the other. 2017, 2018, 2019 is huge. Then you come to 2020, and there's a lot for the first week, and then it stops basically, apart from all my handwritten notes, because obviously we weren't meeting each other face to face. There was nothing happening really physically, so everything's online
because of COVID, we should say.
Because of COVID, yeah. And I think so. Many of the negotiations were happening online, and the information, the changes of practice that had to happen, all of these were trying to be navigated in a really stressful, peculiar situation, particularly for those involved in trade, for hauliers, etc., for manufacturing, for industry, for retail, all of this in a crisis as it is. And then you're bringing in these new rules that have been negotiated at pace. So extremely complicated situation in which many of the things that we took for granted have been completely thrown out the window. So we mustn't lose sight of that either. It was a very peculiar time.
And you mentioned the loyalist paramilitaries who no longer recognise the Good Friday Agreement. What's the situation with that now?
So I think we're in a more stable situation. I mean, would you like to talk about Northern Ireland as it is now?
Yeah.
Because it's interesting. There is a connection, I think. So if you recall, so 2021, this comes into effect, and we have famously a BBC report by John Campbell going to Belfast Harbour saying the new Irish sea border rules are coming into effect. And he was subtweeted by Brandon Lewis, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, saying there is no Irish sea border. Things are flowing smoothly, there's no issue. So you still had that confusion, those mixed messages about what needed to happen. Therefore, basically the UK ends up breaching the protocol. So they quickly come into conflict with the EU about this. It's extremely tense. And it's not just a practical problem for trade, it's also a political one. And very soon we have an unusual situation, I have to say, in which all unionist parties make a declaration saying they want the protocol to go. They oppose it. And you have these mass protests and demonstrations with these unionist representatives and people on the ground, and you have demonstrations with loyalist paramilitaries as well. People associated with loyalist paramilitaries as well. So and they begin to say there's a sort of lingering threat of violence. And the British government point to these threats and they say to the EU, what are you going to do about this? The protocol is breaching peaceful conditions in Northern Ireland. It's making it impossible for the Good Friday Agreement to stand. And they sort of looking to these loyalist threats to try and make the EU move. So it's a very worrying situation. And I think it sort of exposes lots of things, but it's sort of unleashed something too, in that it's showing that there's still, the ability to point to the risk of violence is one that can be resorted to. And even today, in recent times, we've had demonstrations of violence. I'm thinking particularly in relation to the recent targeting of minoritized ethnic communities, etc., in Northern Ireland and immigrant communities. And the use of violence is a means of getting political attention.
Sorry, you're saying that you seem to be implying that that's orchestrated by paramilitaries. Is that what you're implying?
I'm not saying it's orchestrated by them. I'm saying loyalist paramilitaries are involved. And to varying degrees, but we've also got these new dimensions of the social media, etc. But it's a peculiar situation in which the threat of violence and protests are being used to try as sort of leverage in a negotiation with the EU.
Wow.
And I think that's sort of, I remember saying at the time, I was in meetings with key people, and I remember saying, just be careful what you're unleashing here, because you can't put that back in the bottle. If you are saying that violence, the violence on the streets of Northern Ireland is something that the EU will have to respond to, then you're sort of implying that it serves a purpose. And that's terrorism at work. And we didn't, to have any government, and I'd say the same as the Irish government, point to the risk of violence as well. I mean, that's just an admittance of failure, if you like, of democratic politics. And it just sort of shows with this discourse about breaching international law, the breaching of any law as being acceptable is a problem. It shows this new instability.
Yeah.
So we saw that a couple of weeks ago, these things going around online listing house numbers and addresses, saying these are all targets.
God. And that was based on the colour of people's skin. I found that deeply disturbing.
Well, people were meant to think that's what it was. And obviously it had the effect of spreading fear. Obviously profound fear, terror in some cases. And many people have moved because of this. But that list wasn't actually where particularly they didn't know who was living there. It was just a list of houses of multiple occupancy. Sorry. So it was like that. Landlords would be able to rent to several different people. So mainly student accommodation.
Wow.
So that they've just got that list from Belfast City Council. They've just downloaded it and then put it up. But it shows you that. So this is why we're in a different realm now with these external actors and the social media. It's not just loyalist paramilitaries or any paramilitaries still exist. Loyalist and Republican, and they're still active in different ways. But there's this other dimension of stirring up, obviously. All those emotions that then lead people to be on the street and willing to commit those acts of violence. This is a different world now.
Yeah. So then we have the Windsor Framework, which we need to talk about, and that's 2023. Is that correct?
That's right, 2023. Yeah.
And can you explain what it is, why it is, and how is it used, and what's the resistance and the championing of it?
So basically, we had such a situation that the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive weren't able to function because of the unionist protests, particularly the DUP protests about the protocol. So it came to a critical point. We'd also seen Boris Johnson leave. We saw Liz Truss briefly, Prime Minister, and then Rishi Sunak came in 22, and he was determined to reset that relationship with the EU because things were so bad. So they went into talks and they came up with the Windsor Framework, carefully named, and with red, white and blue cover as a command paper, to basically make some adjustments, not to the protocol text itself, but to the way that it was to be implemented. And this was really to allow for the fact that actually implementing it in full really would have been almost impossible for Northern Ireland, given how important trade with the rest of the UK is. So Rishi Sunak came up with this Windsor framework, and we're meant to call the protocol by that name now. We're not meant to use any other name. And it made some very imaginative developments, such as not for EU labelling. So basically to say that if a good is made in Britain and it doesn't necessarily meet EU standards, it can still come into Northern Ireland as long as it is labelled not for EU. So you'll notice this in shelves in Northern Ireland, not for EU. And that means that then if you see a product south of the border that has that label on, that in theory the EU knows there's a problem. There's a gap in that border, so to speak. So that was meant to be helpful, as was some adjustments to what the Assembly can do in having say over EU laws that apply. But again, that's very minimal. That still wasn't. We saw in public opinion, we saw more unionists move towards thinking, okay, this isn't quite so bad, but it wasn't enough to bring the DUP over the line and back into power sharing. And they remained opposed. So they ended up going into negotiations with the British government. And this is extremely unusual if you think about it. All other agreements that are there for the peace process in Northern Ireland have always involved both governments and all parties. This was one party, one government negotiating agreement to try and get power sharing up and running again. And they came up with this. So if the Windsor Framework was February 23, this new deal was announced in January 2024. And this was the so-called Safeguarding the Union deal. And you'd know that it was negotiated between the DUP and the Conservative government because, oh my gosh, it's really red, white and blue, unapologetically pro-union. They throw everything at it to try and persuade unionists that they have nothing to worry about with the Windsor Framework and that the intention of the government really is to keep Northern Ireland close in the union. And it goes so far in that I ended up writing a piece where I saying I'm concerned that it was breaching rigorous impartiality responsibilities of the British government because they were essentially saying, downplaying, in fact, saying the all-island economy doesn't really exist, and et cetera, et cetera. And they brought in new bodies and made new guarantees to try and reassure unionists that, yes, Northern Ireland is an essential part of the UK and an important part of the UK internal market. So we really should think about, where Brexit has brought us from those early days is into a situation where you have several new bodies established to try and, if you like, give sort of voice and profile to Northern Ireland within the UK. At the same time as Northern Ireland having to manage this very unusual position in which it still is in as being de facto in the EU single market for goods and the customs union.
So simple.
Oh, really it is, honestly.
I think that kind of lays out in a succinct way different packages that were offered and where we are today. Maybe if you're up for it, I'd be up for doing this again to see where we are today and looking towards the future from the angles of Northern Ireland, Irish government, British government and European Union and international relations. How does that sound?
That would be fantastic. I'd love to do that, especially where Brexit has brought us today in terms of opinion about all of those things. It would be great.
What do you mean?
Well, Brexit has fundamentally changed dynamics within Northern Ireland, between these islands, including how people perceive these relationships and the future. And I'd be delighted to talk and speculate
cool.
on that with you.
I'll press pause there because I feel that it's almost like a teaser for the next episode. And Katy, it's been wonderful again. I feel like I feel like you're almost like a deep lake, and I'm just a stone skimming over the very top of it and dipping in and out every so often. I'm not getting a lot of it. Where can people find out more about about things that you've published?
Well, we have a website, Post-Brexit Governance. If they Google Post-Brexit Governance NI, it comes up with our website in Queens. With my colleague, Professor David Finnemore, and I and a few other colleagues, we put a lot of our work on Brexit and the protocol and the Windsor Framework.
Brilliant.
So they might like to look there.
Yeah,
if they're suckers for punishment. Yeah.
Can you send me some links and I'll put them in the show notes? Yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah, I will do.
Okay, Katy, until next time, thanks again.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you for listening. If you know someone who might value this conversation, please feel free to pass it on. The Ireland podcast is intended as a record of long-form conversations like this. And if you would like to support the continuation of the work, there is a link in the notes. Take care.